keyboard setup is a little awkward up here, but... So normally I get started just using the skin modifier, and then I go through and just kind of create the general shape that I want. Just for the sake of time, we'll make it fairly simple and direct. We'll just do kind of a simple head of sorts. And really what we're looking for is just the overall kind of general shape and feel. We're not looking at any detail. We're not looking at any like structural form, just the kind of overall volumes. So in this case, this will probably work just fine. And now I will begin sculpting. And again, I'm going to talk about all of this in much more detail once we actually start at 2. So this is just kind of some warm-up, selfishly mostly for me. Okay. Just while we're going, how many of you guys are modelers, by the way? Or in training, want to be, or anything like that? Okay, cool. So we've got quite a few modelers. How many of you do character work? Okay. Hard surface? Organic? Okay, so we've got a pretty good mix. So we're going to be, we are going to be focusing on organic stuff mostly today, but noting that everything that I talk about does apply to both. As our modeling tools in Blender and just in general get better and better, you're actually seeing more of a merging between organic and hard surface modeling, where they're really, it comes much more down to subject matter than the actual tools that you use, because one of the nice things about kind of where modeling is going, again in Blender and just kind of in general, is our tools are getting better and better constantly, such that it really is much more up to the artist, not necessarily the tools that you use. You know, in the past, it used to be like, if you wanted to do hard surface modeling, you would basically always use box modeling, or you would always use poly modeling, or whatever the technique was that you wanted to do. But now we're seeing a lot more of kind of like a merging of the two. And so even though I'm talking specifically about organic modeling today, honestly, that's only because that's what I personally prefer to work with more, and it's a little bit easier to demo live, particularly with the tool set that we're going to be looking at. But just know, for those of you guys that are hard surface modelers or that are interested in modeling everything from cars to airplanes to rooms, what have you, most of this stuff, with maybe the exception of rooms, will still apply. Kind of what I'm doing at the moment is I like to use dynamic topology to kind of block out my shapes, and I'm working almost exclusively with the clay strips tool with dynamic topology enabled, and then also with collapse short edges on now, because that then allows me to work with the clay strips tool. And again, if anyone's lost, don't worry, we're going to be looking at this more overall here soon. What kind of subject matter do you guys mostly model? Feel free to just shout it out. Animals. Is that what?
Animals.
Anything?
Shapes.
There you go. Has anyone not used dynamic topology, just to see if... Are you guys familiar with what it is? Okay. Just checking so that I don't go over anyone's head. One of the nice things about this kind of workflow that we're going to be looking at is it can be as rough or as clean as you want, just due to the flexibility of our tool set. And so in this case, you'll notice it's very, very rough. I'm just kind of playing with shapes and seeing what I like, see what I don't like, and then wiping it out if I don't.
Can you quickly just shortly switch to edit mode to show them that?
Yeah. So when I'm working with a dynamic topology like this, I am actually generating new geometry as I go. So every time, like if I pull out a shape like this, that's all new geometry. And so it's a destructive process, which is one of the things that we're going to start talking about. Is, a lot of us are used to working with modifiers, which are fantastic, they're great. dynamic topology is not a modifier, and so it's very, very destructive. And so if you start thinking of things like making characters for animation,
One little break. Hey, people that sheets have to do that for me. Begin daar, met 5, 6 kind op de raam die dat maakt de hoofdfoto wel een ding.
okay. So one of the things that we're going to be looking at when we start is the destructive nature of dynamic topology and how that then affects our workflow. Because something I think, dynamic topology is a relatively new tool as far as Blender goes, and actually in general, just the process. Since it's completely destructive, and I mean destructive in that it is completely altering your underlying geometry. So if you start with a cube, you start sculpting on it, you don't have a cube anymore. There's no resemblance to a cube even as far as the actual mesh goes. And so that means no matter what you do, you have to recreate that geometry unless you're creating a sculpture. If you're doing a sculpture just for artwork, for printing, whatever, that's a whole other story. Most of what we're going to be talking about assumes, Sean, there's seats in here if you want. Yeah, there's still like 5 or 6, 7 seats. So, most of what we'll be talking about for the second and third parts of the talk basically assume that you're creating a model that either needs to be used for games, for film, for anything other than sculpture, basically. And we've got about 15 minutes. And for anyone that just entered, basically what we're doing, my talk doesn't actually start till 2, and so just for anyone that's trying to follow the schedule fairly rigorously, I'm just going to basically do some warm-up sculpting of sorts. Feel free to shout out any questions you have along the ways, and then at 2 we'll start the actual workshop of looking at creating a organic modeling workflow within Blender. Let's see, I forget where I was, but so I'm just going to... But yeah, so one of the nice things about the dynamic topology when we're working on something like this is we're really not tied to our design. So like for right now, he's starting to look a little bit like an evil clown. Personally, I'm not a fan of clowns, so we're going to change that. And we can really do whatever we want here. If we don't like it at all, then we can simply, make sure dynamic is on. We'll just get rid of it. So we've got a lot of flexibility when we're working with dynamic, which is really nice. But the things that you have to be aware of is, since it's completely destructive, just remember that anything you create, you're going to have to recreate in a way. Again, assuming you're not doing sculptural work. Although if you are doing sculptural work, dynamic is even better because then you don't have to do anything, you just sculpt and it's awesome.
Sorry, if you're doing things like that, like adding and removing geometry, is this in a way, I mean, going to say, when you do it too often, creating additional geometry, which would kind of mess up the whole thing, or is this really, can you really do it that freely that it's just not, if you do it, just go back and it's not a problem at a later stage or so. If you do things like that, you code it out and delete it and so on.
So it's not necessarily a problem. It kind of depends on how much you care about the surrounding area around it. Basically, if you want to, like where I removed his weird ear horns a moment ago, if you want to get rid of that, basically you have 2 options. One, 3 options. You can either go into edit mode, select all the vertices, delete them, and then fill in the hole that's left. If you're working on any kind of complex model, once you start getting over like 100,000 vertices or something, that becomes really cumbersome, particularly because it's not a select-friendly mesh. It's just a bunch of triangles. So that's one option. Not a very good one generally. Another option is to use the collapse short edges, which is the option down here. You've been seeing me enable it like this. This is just my little Python add-on that I've got for just a series of options that I use all the time. So I just put them into a menu. So that's one option, where collapse short edges, basically anything that's under your detail size, it'll just automatically remove it. So for example, like if I have this area right here, so here's a little lump. If I decide I don't want that, the only thing I have to do is make sure collapse short edges is on, zoom out to where those edges are shorter than my detail size, and this is based in pixels. You don't have to measure it, just approximate, and then just sculpt over it. But that's a little bit more difficult to do with large areas. You did see me do that with the horns. I zoomed way out and then sculpt on it, where you start simplifying areas like that. The thing to be aware of, though, is that you don't have much precision, and so you're going to wipe out the surrounding areas. So if, say, like if I wanted to get rid of the horns, we'll give them horns real quick. All right, I want to get rid of the horns, but let's just say I've got some really nice, where's my blob? There it is. I have some really nice detail right there. I know it's pretty. If we want to get rid of that, if I zoom out here, it's pretty hard to do with collapse short edges. So what you can do instead is just leave sculpt mode, grab an object, and you're just basically going to Boolean it. So you don't have to, you can get as accurate or inaccurate as you like, and then you're just going to select them, and you're going to Boolean it. Then you can wipe it out, apply it, go back into sculpt, re-enable dynamic, and then down here we've got a symmetrize option, so you can just choose the side that you want. In this case I want to keep the positive side, symmetrize, and done. So you can get pretty accurate with that. It's going to take time, but if you really care about your detail in there, then you got it. Plus, we now have Hellboy, so that works too. What's my time? Okay, we'll probably start a little bit early. If people miss it, then we can catch them up or whatnot. Is there any questions before we start? Or anything that you hope to learn or see covered as far as sculpting goes? Yeah?
Maybe some way to information like UV.
So how to sculpt in detail without losing UV data or any other kind of mesh data? We'll talk about that. Short answer, you can't if you're doing dynamic, but that's where, we absolutely care about that. So he's got a really good question. Basically asks, how can you sculpt on a model, add in detail without losing things like your UV unwraps, your vertex paint data, anything like that, any kind of mesh data. If you're sculpting with dynamic topology, you will lose that. There's just no way around it. However, what we'll do and what we'll be looking at is how to combine dynamic topology sculpting with then retopologized or a retopologized mesh to then do multi-resolution sculpting, because multi-resolution maintains all of that kind of data, and so we'll look at basically how to go through that process. And really that's kind of the start and end. You start with dynamic, you end with multi-resolution. And yeah, so we'll talk about that for sure. Anything else? Cool. Well, I think I'll go ahead and just get started. So what I have, and I guess since this is kind of the beginning, I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Jonathan Williamson. I run BlenderCookie.com, mostly doing tutorials, but primarily focus on the modeling side. And so what we're going to talk about, and I know I've repeated myself a couple of times, apologies for those of you guys that have heard it. Basically, we're going to look at how to create a full workflow within Blender from start to finish in modeling. So we have dynamic topology, we have multi-resolution. These are two very, very different sculpting workflows, and they use the same brushes, but everything else about them is different, basically. Both of them are very, very powerful, but since we got dynamic topology, which was about a year ago or something like that, I've seen a lot of confusion as far as, do you have to use dynamic or do you have to use multi-resolution? Can you use them both together? Where is that kind of marriage between the two, or is there one? And so basically we're going to be looking at how to combine the benefits of dynamic topology sculpting, which gives you a very, very gestural sculpting. It's really great for exploring forms, if you're doing any kind of sculptural work, or if you just want to have a lot of flexibility within your sculpt, dynamic topology is really, really good. But we have the problem with dynamic topology that the mesh that it creates is an absolute disaster as far as, when thinking about it from the term, or from the sense of like good topology for animation. You can, but you essentially cannot animate a dynamic topology mesh. Yes, you can, technically. You don't want to. It's going to be a mess. So what we do is we start with dynamic topology, we sculpt out our forms, we get to be all artistic and have fun. We then retopologize it using all of the forms that we already have, and that way we can focus on just the topology, where if anyone's not familiar with retopology, basically just means to recreate the mesh of an existing form with a new structure. So create a better mesh. And from there, once we have a really good mesh, we can do whatever we want with it. So we've got our nice forms that we created with dynamic topology, we create the good mesh, and then we can take that, we can either animate it directly, we can bake down textures, we can texture it, we can do kind of whatever we want. In this case, what we want to do is we want to be able to add really good detail. So one of the things that you'll find with dynamic topology is it's really, really good for doing large forms, for doing major details, like if you want to do muscle forms and things like that. And or even if you want to do any kind of hard surface modeling. So like my colleague Kent Trammell did a course on Blender Cookie on creating a sci-fi weapon with dynamic topology. So that would be hard surface sculpting. What I'm going to be doing today is organic sculpting. Just remember that even though I'm demoing organic, mostly everything that we talk about applies to hard surface as well. But so the nice thing with that is we can then create our nice forms, but then use the multi-resolution to then do all of our detail work. So for example, if you sculpt a face, you create all the structure, you've got the nice muscle structures, the shapes, etc. That's really easy to do in dynamic topology. But one of the downsides to it is, let's say you then want to animate that face. Well, you've lost all your detail when you retopologize it, because you don't want to have a mesh that's a gazillion quads to animate. You want to keep it nice and simple. So that's where you then stack on the multi-resolution. So what we're going to look at real quick, I'm just going to pop through a couple of files. So I have this concept art that I found on CG Hub that I thought just had some nice details in it. I kind of like the design. And mostly it's got, the area that we're looking at is basically the face and then the horns. And so I sculpted this the other night, and I started out with using a skin modifier. So this is just a string of vertices connected by edges, which then uses the skin modifier over here to then generate the overall shape. This is nice because it allows me to very quickly create the overall shape such that I can then go ahead and take it right into sculpt mode. I just have to apply all the modifiers. And I can take it into sculpt mode. And I just want to go over down here. I'm going to enable dynamic topology. The detail size, just remember the larger the number, the larger the smallest detail can be. So in this case, we'll start larger and then we'll get smaller. We'll just go to that'll be fine, 20. And from here, I can just start sculpting. Now, I'm probably going to want, oops, there we go. I'm going to want X symmetry on, there we go. And so this is really good because I've got my rough shape, and now I can go in and start adding things like eyeball sockets. I can start adding noses. As a general good practice, it's best to not think about detail at this stage. You're just creating the overall forms. But this is good. So we're able to do this, and we're going to look at this more in just a moment. But the next stage of this, let's assume that we've got our dynamic sculpt done. So after a lot of sculpting, we come up with this. So we've got the hair, we've got the horns, we've got the...
What happened to step 2?
You just sculpt. Yeah, so we are actually going to look at it. Hopefully we have time to actually do some actual sculpting and look at more detail, but I want to give kind of a broad picture first. So we start with the base mesh, we go through the sculpting, and we come up with a design that we're happy with. And for that stage, it's personal recommendation that you don't get too worried about detail. Now, I actually didn't follow this very well in my own example, because you'll see things like I started doing like the inside of the eyes, the fold above the eyelids, started doing the detail on the lips. That was a really bad, that wasn't necessarily a bad idea, but one of the downsides to dynamic topology is it's pretty hard to get really nice, clean surfaces. You know, you can see this looks pretty smooth in here, and we can make it look smoother. But if you were to bake this down, say like if you're baking a normal map, you're baking ambient occlusion, whatever it is, you're transferring the surface detail of this to our retopologized model over here, you're going to get all of those little artifacts in that surface. So like if we look over here, you know, you've got a little glitch here, you've got a little one here, a little one here, a little one here, and they may seem like little things, and they are little things. You could clean them up pretty easily in Photoshop or whatever using, you know, blur tools or whatnot, but really we don't really want those in our bake. Ideally, if we're baking, which if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, don't worry about it, it's secondary to what we're doing today. Just know that it's not very ideal, and you don't really want to be doing cleanup work like that if you can avoid it, and so that's where we're going to be doing that kind of detail work in the multi-resolution modifier, or in the multi-resolution sculpt. So we have our sculpt, and from here we want to create our retopologized form. So what I was starting to talk about is basically when you're doing the dynamic topology sculpt, focus on your major details. Focus on the shape of the lips, the shape of the brows, the insets in a hard surface sci-fi panel, or whatever those major forms are that define the shape of your object, not the surface of the object. And so surface details would be things like skin pores, small wrinkles, little bits of rust, that kind of stuff. You don't really need to do at this stage because it doesn't affect the overall shape. It just affects the kind of the surface aesthetic of it. So once you have this though, and you have all your major shapes and things like that, you notice in the hair, I went and started, and this is not done at all, you can ignore all of that. But on things like this, the shapes and such that I was really looking at are things like, let me just set this to the surface. Things like these big, long curves. These are the things that really define the silhouette and the shape and the feeling that we get from this. If we zoom out way out here, what are the shapes that you start to recognize? That's the kind of stuff that you want to be doing in dynamic topology. Again, assuming that you're doing this for like an animation or a game model. If you're doing it for sculpture, absolutely jump right in, do all that surface detail, because that's going to show up in your final sculpt. So where do we go from here? So once we have the dynamic topology sculpt done, we can jump into the retopology. The retopology is the fun part for me, because it's where we go in and we recreate the mesh. So if you remember, if you look at this mesh, this one right here, if we go into edit mode, it's dense. There's a lot there. Feel free to try and work with that in edit mode. Feel free to try and animate it or do anything. You're not going to get much done. So what we do is we recreate that shape, and that's what this is. So this is a retopologized version of this same head, and where we've recreated all the surface. And this is why I say you don't need to worry about all the detail in the dynamic topology sculpt. Because notice I've got this, the fold above the eyelid. Do you see that fold in this one? No, because it's not there. Because for this mesh, the density is going to vary. This is what I would call kind of like a mid-level dense mesh. It's fairly dense. We've got enough in there to do most things, but if we start doing some like intricate wrinkles around the eyes, if we want to animate, really deep crow's feet, or if they're doing very expressive mouth movements and things like that, we're probably going to need a little bit more geometry in here, but that's kind of the purpose of the retopology, is you create it clean. So like if I needed to go in and do that, and do that, and do that, suddenly I've got a lot more geometry to work with to then make those areas more expressive or whatever I want to do. But I still don't capture these kinds of small details unless absolutely necessary. So when I say you don't need to focus on those in the dynamic topology phase, it's just because you're wasting time, because you're going to be doing it again in the next phase, which is the multi-res sculpting. So this is where the multi-res sculpting is where I take that retopologized mesh, you can see it's the same model, and we add a multi-resolution modifier like this, so we'll just take that down. So here's our original mesh, and then bit by bit, using the multi-res, we'll go in, we'll go up a level, we'll sculpt in some forms, we'll, maybe we decide that, hey, I'd like to make the cheekbones a little bonier, I want to give a little bit more crease definition around the mouth, or anything like that. If you want to do subtle shape changes. The other thing we can do is like, you know what, maybe we decide we want her ears to be really big. Well, that's something that now that we have a nice retopologized mesh, we can do that pretty easily. So we can make like big structural changes to it to a degree without affecting the detail. So we can go in and start doing the actual detail sculpting. So this is the phase where not only can we make structural changes, ideally you should do this at the lowest level before you get too far along, but we can start doing the small details like around the eye, start doing the eyebrows, start doing the creases in the lips. Because then this detail, you notice that this surface is really nice and smooth because I don't have all of those, varying levels of triangle density within my mesh like we did on the dynamic topology. Remember, the dynamic topology, in some areas, we would have a mesh so dense you couldn't see through it, and yet so like this area is, wow, that's really slow. That's supposed to be a circle. So like this area is completely solid, say, within the mesh density, and yet down here we start seeing much larger polygons within our surface, and that's where you start to see some of those the glitches pop up, like what we were looking at right here. You start to see some of these, and like I can go in and I can start trying to smooth these out, but if you see a lot of variation within the mesh in the density, like you can see, like this area obviously is really dense. This area is not so dense. You're going to have a really hard time smoothing this out. Part of that is just the dynamic topology tools. They don't, it has a hard time smoothing that very well. So we could just either remove density here or add density over here, and then it would be able to smooth out really well. But that's pretty difficult when you're working all over the model to make it all really uniform. So that's not to say that you couldn't create a really smooth surface with dynamic topology. You notice like around the nose, this is pretty darn smooth. Like I really don't care if, I don't need that to be any smoother. But some areas like this, like these spots down here, you notice down here at the bottom of the chin, there's lots of rough spots. Now I could of course smooth those out, but you don't see that. Oops. You don't see that on here. Here it's totally smooth. And the reason that it's totally smooth is because the sculpting input that we're taking is our cleanly retopologized mesh, which for the most part has evenly distributed geometry, at least within the localized area. So all of the geometry around the eyes is relatively smooth. Now, I should probably add in a few more loops right here and here and whatnot to make these a little bit more square, but I was doing this way too late last night. So that's where that becomes really, really smooth because we're subdividing everything evenly. Where dynamic topology is all localized. You're adding in geometry only where you sculpt, unless you specify otherwise. Whereas when I add a level of multi-res, if I go in here and I subdivide this thing again, I'm not only subdividing the eye, I'm subdividing the entire mesh, which takes the original one as the input. So this gives me a really nice, clean surface that if I want to bake it, I want to add in nice uniform detail, I can do all of that stuff really, really easily. So that's kind of the broad picture of starting with dynamic, going to multi-res, and then kind of everything in between. From here, what you would basically do is you would do whatever you want to do. You would take your model, you could rig it, you could UV unwrap it, you can texture it, whatever. So an example of that is this guy. So this was a model that I just did for 3D Artist. And here's the original base mesh. So this is, again, just a skin modifier mesh. You can see the actual geometry in here is, whoops, not that one. So this is the actual geometry. Very, very simple. It just gives me my overall volumes and forms. From here, I would go and I'd apply the modifier, and then I would start sculpting. So this is then the dynamic topology sculpt. So this is based on that exact same mesh minus the wings. The wings are separate. just because I don't recommend trying to extrude membranes like that from a dynamic topology mesh. It's a pain in the ass. Just model them as planes. You can Boolean them later. So then this is the dynamic topology mesh. So like, if you go in here, you notice here again, I got a little bit too pulled in with the detail because it's just really fun to do. I didn't need to do any of this in here. If we start doing things like, if I bring up the polish brush, we can get rid of all of that detail because none of that is going to play into the form that we create during the retopology process. So that's the dynamic topology sculpt. And then from there, we can go in and start retopologizing it. So then this is the final retopologized mesh. By the way, I don't recommend doing membranes. They take freaking forever. Even with things like the grid fill tool. So this then, once we've got our sculpt, this then gives us our nice clean mesh, which we can then rig, we can animate, we can texture it, we can kind of do whatever. In my case, I then went in and did some additional multi-res sculpting. So this takes the original input from the retopology mesh and then goes in and sculpts in a bunch more detail. So if we go down here, we can just, I've already applied. Imagine that this, it does. I had the wrong thing selected. Here we go. So there's my original retopologized mesh. I only subdivided it twice because it gave me all the resolution that I needed. There's a little bit more form, starting to define some more muscle detail, defining a few more wrinkles, things like the nose, the eyes, etc. I'm doing some minor shape tweaking. So like if you look in here, you'll notice that the profile that you see right here changes a little bit. I don't actually recommend doing that. That actually gave me some problems later down the road when I tried to do some more rigging and whatnot. Just some things happened with the baking that didn't work very well because I was baking from this version down to the lower level, and so that gave me some weird errors. So once you retopologize, try not to change the shape in there, but you can if you need to. And then from here, once I have this, now that I have all my detail, I've got a nice clean mesh, I can deform it pretty easily to then do something like this. So then this is the final rigged model. Well, no, this is actually a baked rig. So I go in, I pose it, and then I apply the pose to make it real, such that then I can go in and do a bunch of cleanup work. Like there was a whole bunch of the membrane sides were intersecting right in here. These deformations were really crappy. There was lots of waving right in here. So then you can just apply your pose from the armature, just applying the modifier, and then do any kind of additional detail sculpting that you want on here. So this is a sculptural example where after doing the multi-res sculpt, I said, I want this, it's just a sculptural piece. I'm not animating it, I'm not doing anything, I just want a sculpture. So then I can go and make use of this sculpting tools even more and do whatever I want with it. So this is actually a case where I could do this even better if I actually just applied the multi-res now and then did any additional dynamic topology sculpting on it. But I wanted to keep it flexible because I didn't know if I was going to stick with this pose. Maybe I wanted to go in and pose the fingers up here since they're not actually even posed, but they didn't show in the camera, so I didn't care. There's a lot of things like that we can then go in and work from there. So let's back up and go back to the base mesh. Let me check my time. Okay. Hey, we're actually only starting now, so we've got time. So we want to go ahead and sculpt this. Before I start the actual sculpting process, from what I just showed you, the overall broad spectrum, going from this to the final sculpt in one step, it's quick, it's nice when we do that. Do you have any questions as far as the sculpting process that I can answer before we get going on it? Yeah?
Is there a way if we had this, press Alt and you have the wrinkles in the eyes?
Uh-huh.
You decide you want to transfer them to the multi-res.
So transfer detail from a dynamic to the multi-res? Okay, so the question is for any of you on the live stream or that couldn't hear, basically she's asking, is there any way to transfer detail within a sculpt on a dynamic topology mesh to a multi-res mesh?
For example, just localize on this.
Yeah, okay, so particularly if you transfer them just in a local area like the wrinkles around the eye, maybe you sculpt the wrinkles one way in the dynamic, they look really, really nice, and then you sculpt them again in multi-res and they look really crappy. It happens all the time. Yes and no. Let me get back to you. I don't think so. Well, you could shrink wrap it, but you can't shrink wrap anything but the lowest level of multi-res. No, that's not true. Yeah, you could shrink wrap it. Sorry? You could also make a bump map, but with the bump map, you wouldn't actually transfer the geometry detail. So you're saying use a displacement map? Yeah, so you could use a displacement map. The problem with both of those techniques, using the shrink wrap or the displacement, is you have no way to bake that down into the multi-res. Multi-res is really annoying as a modifier, and I don't know if this is even a solvable problem. Basically, the multi-resolution modifier has to take original data. That's why it requires it be on the top of the modifier stack. And so you can't actually alter the geometry via a modifier that goes into multi-res. You can only alter it based on what's in edit mode, essentially. So like if you went in and applied the shrink wrap, I think you would actually lose those transformations. Is it working? Oh, okay, so try the shrink wrap. Maybe that will work. Yeah, that might just do it. So I don't know what I'm talking about. It's okay. Regardless, it's kind of a messy process, but yeah, like you said, there should definitely be ways to do it. Yeah?
Just a small suggestion. Can you show the shortcuts
Yeah.
in the user preferences with those and force? Because you're just doing cool stuff and I just don't know what you're doing.
Let's see. There we go.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes?
Yeah, and this is not related exactly to sculpting, but do you recommend to use matcaps for sculpting?
No. So we have matte caps in Blender. Under the shading option, you can just enable a matte cap, and it will show your currently selected object with basically a shading sphere. It's really nice for getting a clean display. Personally, I don't really like using them in sculpting. I don't really have a good objection to it. It's just not personal preference. One of the advantages to matte caps is you'll notice that it's baked in lighting. So like if I go in and change this, it kind of alters the lighting on the model based on the sphere. This is great, and it's something you should definitely be doing to be checking your model from all different angles. Light it from the bottom, light it from the side, light it from the top. But there's actually a better way to do that, and that is use Sean Olsen's add-on called Quick Preferences, which gives you easy access to these right here, and you can actually go in and you can just change the direction of the lighting right in the viewport. You can go ahead and disable these. So like right now there's only one light. I can go in, I can change that, and so this gives you much greater control. So like if you just want to light it from the top, cool, it's lit from the top. Now I can see kind of the silhouette across the shapes and whatnot that I'm working on. So that's personally what I would recommend. I'm going to reopen that.
The matcaps work with masking. As far as I know, the matcap doesn't work with masking right now.
Let's find out.
This kind of big problem.
Oh, I'm on the wrong object. Ooh, no. They don't work. So, yeah, so that's definitely a downside to using matte caps when sculpting, because you cannot use you can't see the masking. Okay, so we'll do some more questions. I'll try and stop periodically for questions. At any point, feel free to raise your hand, and I'll try and answer questions as we go. Let's go ahead and get started though, so that we don't get too far behind. Okay, so we have our base mesh. Is everyone kind of clear on how we create the base mesh? And it's okay to say no. No? Yes? Say something, or I don't know what you mean. Okay, that doesn't count. Okay, well, if you're not sure, base mesh, it's just a skin modifier. So we create a series of edges, we add in the skin modifier right here, right there, and then if you place a mirror modifier above it, the mirror or the skin modifier will take the results of the mirror and give you a nice symmetrical mesh, so you can do things like this. So it works really well for creating that shape. If you want to alter the size at any point, just simply select the point, hit Control-A, and you can adjust the scale along that angle. When you're doing this, forget about detail. You don't care about the eye placement, you don't care about the mouth. The only thing you really care about is the overall shape. So the overall shape, I can see I've got kind of an arc for the face. This is my chin line. This is where the neck goes. That's all. it's very, very simple. And this is one of the advantages to the dynamic topology sculpting is since we're using dynamic topology, we're very, very flexible. So we create our base mesh. And then we need to apply this. So we're just going to apply all the modifiers. You can either do this one by one, or I've got it built in my quick tools here. I'm just going to click apply all modifiers. Same thing as doing one by one, that's all. And we're going to hide the hair object for now. You notice that I made the hair a separate object. That's just because the face is symmetrical, the hair is not. So I want to use symmetry on the face, I don't want it on the hair. I could combine them because I can just turn off symmetry whenever I want. I just find it easier to use two objects. And also, anytime you're doing a single one, I personally just find the transition between the head and the hair a lot easier to do if they're separate objects. So we're going to go in sculpt mode, if I select my mesh. And we're going to then enable dynamic topology. And I'm going to try and, for everything that we do, I'm going to try and show you how to do it the normal way first, and then any other consecutive time I'll do it with my quick tool stuff. So, because this is stuff I do like 100 times a day. So we're going to do enable dynamic, and you'll notice that it immediately tessellates our mesh. If we go into edit mode, you can see this. If I had any kind of UV data, let's just say if I select this, I do a smart UV project. Cool, I have UV data now, even though it's probably really, really ugly. I go back into sculpt mode, I enable dynamic, you notice that it warns you. And soon as if you click accept, you will lose UV data, you will lose any kind of vertex colors, anything you've added to that, you'll lose it. So if you have that kind of information, for whatever reason, just duplicate your model first, or lose it if you don't care. So we're going to lose it, that's fine, and then we can start sculpting. If I just start sculpting, personally, at this stage, I really like to use the two main brushes that I use are clay strips and snake hook. Clay strips just because it allows me to really it's exactly what it sounds like. I can just lay down a strip at a time, and it works really nice for building up and subtracting volume. The snake hook because it allows me to do things like that, or whatever I want to do. And if you then combine that with the option for collapse short edges, it works even better. But for now, we'll just use clay strips. Now, let me move there we go. You will notice, by the way, if I use clay strips just with the C key, by default, C goes to just the clay brush. I just use the clay strips more, so I just changed it. So we can start sculpting. Now you notice I don't have symmetry on right now, so let's just go down and we will enable symmetry right here along the x-axis. And what we want to do at this point, first thing is check our detail size. Right now, our detail size, you can see that it's generating quite a lot of geometry, and depending on the speed of our system, that may or may not be a problem, but we don't need that much geometry right now, and it's probably best that we not have it, because when we have a really dense, smooth mesh generated, it's going to subconsciously encourage us to focus on detail. We don't want to focus on detail yet, because right now our form sucks. It looks nothing like our reference. So we want to go and we want to focus on things like the bony structures. We want to focus on the cheekbones, the skull structure underneath, the muscle forms. We're not looking at the little details. So I definitely encourage you to use basically the largest detail size that you can for what you want to do. Now, you don't have to get too particular about it. Just keep that in mind that when you're at this stage, use a larger detail size rather, because you don't care about a smooth model. One of the things that we always think about is, we subconsciously, since we're creating something organic, we want a really nice, smooth surface. You want polished skin or whatever it is that you're going for. We don't care about that right now. If you ever watch a professional sculptor that's working in clay, you should see how messy their models are initially. Like they just, there's clay everywhere. Do the same thing when you're sculpting, because sculpting with dynamic topology is very much like sculpting with clay. I can definitely tell you, if any of you guys are interested in doing this kind of stuff, either professionally or just to a larger degree than you are now, take traditional sculpting classes. They will help so much. So we're just going to go up to like 25 will be fine. I'm not going to get too particular about it. So it's much larger now, encouraging me to really just kind of focus on the forms. From here, you basically just want to go all over. You're working on the eye sockets, you're working on the shape of the skull. Depending on what you're doing, is going to define kind of how particular you need to get. In this case, since I am doing a humanoid head, I definitely want to focus on the skull first, since that's the foundation of everything of the head. Now, I'm not going to actually like sculpt the complete skull, but what I want to be looking at are things like, hey, make sure that, the size of the cranium is what it should be approximately. Are my eye sockets in the right place? Do I have my cheekbones in there? All of that kind of stuff is really what we're looking at. Do we have the shape of the jaw to bring out, the overall form of the mouth here? And again, since we're only focusing on the major details, I'm not doing things like lips, I'm not doing things like eyelids. That kind of stuff all comes later. And this applies to if you're doing organic sculpting, you're doing hard surface sculpting, it really doesn't matter what you're doing, because it's much more about the process than it is about the subject matter. One thing I do like to do when I'm sculpting at this stage is I like to enable render only, which you can find under the display section, only render, because that's just it's going to hide the grid, it's going to hide the cursor, it's going to hide any wireframes or anything like that, and just gives me a cleaner environment to sculpt on, so it's less distracting. One thing I like to do too is if I use the snake hook brush, which I've just set a hotkey to Alt-Shift-S, I can use this to really quickly kind of tweak my forms, grab this back here. Right now, you notice I'm using it with a sharp curve. I actually want to use a smooth curve. I'm going, maybe maybe the cranium needs to be a little bit larger or whatnot. And we're not going to get too particular on that, just because that's more subject specific. I want to just look at more like the overall workflow. But this is kind of the type of stuff that I'm doing at this stage, just to ensure that I'm building a foundation is all I'm doing right now. Once I get a little further, then I start doing detail where I start caring about, hey, how's that exact muscle shaped? How is, that surface looking? Is it smooth? Is it hard? Does it have, rough spots? That kind of stuff. This is really the fun part of the sculpting, because you can really just go quickly and not get too absorbed in anything that you're doing, while also getting completely absorbed at the same time and sculpt for hours and forget that there's things like eating that are important. Okay, so we would normally take this a lot further, but since we're going to be short for time today, I'm not going to take it too far. One thing I will tell you that I like to do is definitely try and just brush over every part of your model quickly with the dynamic topology if you've worked from a base mesh, because that just ensures that most of your geometry is relatively even so that you can start doing things. When you're working with dynamic, if you don't have enough geometry in there, like right there, I didn't have enough, and so when I inflated, since I'm using collapsed short edges, then I start losing form in there, and I can even, in some cases, like if I zoom out far enough, I start doing that, I get disconnected pieces. So what collapsed short edges does, it's really, really nice. Basically, anytime it detects an edge, such as like this edge right here, if I sculpt over that, and that edge is shorter than the detail length right here, it's going to delete that edge and basically make it conform to the detail size. So it's good if you need to, like if you go in here, like zoom in, way in here, and I sculpt on a whole bunch of little stuff right here. If I zoom way out, I don't care about that. Like I've just given myself a bit of a mess. So that's where then the collapsed short edges comes in, because I can just sculpt over it again and it's gone. Whereas if I weren't using that, then I would have a lot of dense geometry because I zoomed in too close, and it just becomes a problem later on, and it's way heavier than it needs to be. So, but by going over everything quickly with your brush, with dynamic enabled, you'll just be sure that everything gets tessellated and behaves nice and normal, and you can do things like, inflate areas or do whatever else you need. Yeah?
I just saw that is this the size or the parameter, is these view dependent in a way when you're closer to the mesh?
Yeah, so the size parameter here, detail size, it's detail size in pixels, and so it's based on your current view depth. Yeah, good question. Okay, so I won't take this any further. No, actually, I will do one thing. Yeah.
To exactly this, but collapsed short edges then use global values, or
Say what?
collapsed short edges, does it work with global values independent from the detail size, or with the same ones? Because when they are changing, when you're zooming?
Yeah, so it's based on my current view, such like if I zoom way out here and I sculpt over this, it's going to delete a lot more geometry than if I zoom in. So it's based on your current viewing depth.
Without changing.
No. Well, you can. You just, like if I zoom out and it takes out too much, I can just increase or decrease the detail size, and it'll like keep more geometry then, but it's faster just to zoom in and out. For one, things like the detail size can start getting a little slow when you're working with dynamic, just because it's very memory intensive and stuff like that. So the last thing I want to talk about at this stage of the sculpting process before we get into just working with the final sculpt, because really this stage, it's all about practice. If you're struggling with this stage, just sculpt more, study more anatomy. If you're doing organic forms, study more anatomy. If you're sculpting cars, study more whatever. I'm not a car person. So just be studying your subject matter, because then once you know how to use the tools, it's just a matter of applying them. And watch people sculpt, for one, is really valuable, but don't just watch what they're creating, watch how they're doing it. There's a sculptor, his name's Andrew Kars, who's really phenomenal, and when he sculpts in clay, watching him put down like muscles is insane, because he'll take a chunk of clay, he's got an open arm, one swipe, and it's there, and he's got it, and it looks like it should, basically. It's not final, but the form is there. And so watching the way that people use the tools is really, really valuable, and you can learn an awful lot from that. But so before we get into the retopology, the one thing that I find really important to do at this stage with our very gorgeous model here is to put in the eyes. So I see a lot of times you'll see people try and sculpt the eyeballs directly into the dynamic topology, which you can do, absolutely. There's not necessarily a problem with it, but it's a heck of a lot easier if you just use a UV sphere separately. So generally I'll just add a sphere, place it approximately, and say something like, all right, we'll call that close enough. It doesn't have to be exact. I'm going to add in a mirror, and we will subserve that. Okay, so we've got our eyeball, because from here you can start going in using just the clay strips again. One thing to note, every time that you leave object or leave sculpt mode, you have to re-enable dynamic. So we'll re-enable dynamic, and then we can go in and start sculpting. So then, just basically you just want to get the overall shape of the eyes. If we look at her eyes here, you can see it's a fairly smooth arc on top, maybe a little bit sharper of a curve here in the inside of the eye, and it's mostly straight across the bottom. So we just go in, sculpt that out, and that's it. So just that alone, even though it looks awful, will give me enough to really start building my foundations. Because if you don't have an eyeball in there, for one, it takes more practice, but it's hard to get the size more correct. And so you'll be sculpting, you'll make it really, really nice, and then you zoom out and you realize that your eyeball is like this big, and that doesn't work very well. So putting the eyeball in early just makes it a lot easier to then sculpt all the things around it. You'll probably find yourself getting a lot more, much better placement of the brows, of the cheekbones, etc. So let's assume that our model is now gorgeous and we want to do the retopology stage. So again, for those of you that are not familiar with retopology basically just means to recreate a clean mesh over an existing surface. The nice thing about using retopology combined with a sculpting workflow is sculpting is a very artistic process, particularly when you're working with dynamic. You're working with shapes and forms, surface treatment, etc. It's a very artistic process. Topology, or creating a clean mesh, is a very technical process. You need to know the mesh flow, you need to use the exact tools, are you extruding, are you filling, are you cutting, whatever else you're doing. It's a very technical process. It's a lot like building a house versus painting a house. Completely different process, but they both apply to the same finished result. So the nice thing about doing it this way, where you sculpt first, retopo later, is you can focus all your energy on each stage of the process. Focus all your artistic energy just on sculpting. Then focus all your technical energy just on retopo. Whereas, in the past, before we had good sculpting, we would polymodel everything. So we would box model a character, or we would, extrude an entire face edge by edge. If you've ever seen some of my old videos, that's the way that I would do it. I would just build it out of faces from the get-go, which was fine, but then you're splitting your energy both ways, and you've only got half your energy for artistic, half of it for technical, or any other combination. And And generally, your results are not going to be as good. It's much easier to get a nice, pleasing model if you're only focused on the shape than if you're trying to do both at the same time. So that's why it's really nice to kind of split the two apart. So, our retopo tools aren't too bad in Blender. The way that we're going to do this, basically you take your original object, and let's switch this to the outliner. We don't care about her anymore. And that's the nice thing, we assume that we've recreated the concept, we don't care anymore. We can just forget about it. And so if you want, if you're working in a team and you have somebody that's an amazing sculptor, you don't even care if they have good topology skills because you can then just send that to somebody else to retopo. So it just helps, the whole process a lot more. So we'll call this our sculpt. And we're just going to add in a new mesh. It can be anything. We'll just create a plane. It doesn't matter. We'll name this our retopo. All right, from here, we're going to go into edit mode and just delete everything. So we just have an empty mesh now. And actually, if Pablo Vasquez actually has an add-on. I don't know if he's here. No, I don't think so. He actually has an add-on just to create an empty mesh because otherwise you're constantly adding a mesh and then deleting everything. So if you do this kind of stuff a lot, it's a little thing, but it's nice. So the way the retopo works by default in Blender is we use what's called surface snapping. So you go down here to the snapping options, and you're going to enable snapping on the face. So it's actually face snapping, not surface snapping. This probably should be renamed. I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. So you snap to the face, and you just have to enable one other option, which is this one right here, which allows you to snap onto other objects as well. So not only onto itself, but onto other objects. So enable that, and then we can start the retopo process. So generally I'll start just by using the quick extrude, which is just control left click. It will place a vertex. Now, there's one problem with this tool in that when you control click to just add an extrusion for the first time, it does not automatically snap to the surface. So snapping, actually, you know what, maybe it does. Yes, it does, if you have snapping enabled. So just make sure that snapping is on by default, otherwise you have to hold down control. So we enable that, and now it's actually snapped to the surface, so I can move it around, and it conforms. I don't know if you can, the vertex is right there if you can't see it. Let me do this, one sec. There we go. Okay, maybe you can still see it. So I would go ahead and add in a mirror modifier at this point because remember we're working on a symmetrical model, so we're going to add clipping as well. And at this point, this is where your topology knowledge becomes really, really valuable and essential because you need to know what creates a good mesh. If you're not familiar with what creates a good mesh, a couple of key things to keep in mind without going into a complete lecture because this is something you can lecture for days on. Follow the muscle flow for the most part. Follow the muscle flow of, and this is again assuming organic. If it's not organic, it doesn't matter nearly as much. Follow the muscle flow and follow the, add enough geometry to create the shapes that you need. For example, if you need to create wrinkles above your eyelids and you only have 2 edge loops in here, you're not going to create those wrinkles no matter what you do. So think of the amount of geometry that you need and the path and flow of that geometry. So let's just say we're doing the area right in here. I can just tell you that basically the flow that we want coming from the bridge of the nose, we're going to do something better. So we can really see this, let's use this one. And we're just going to do the face. Okay. There it is. What is good? Oh. There it is. I wasn't snapping to the other objects. Okay, so if we want to do this area, basically the flow we're going to be looking for is something roughly like this. So we could simply go in, we'll have our one vertex, we'll extrude a single edge, and let me just re-enable the screencast keys. And we'll just make it larger. Okay, so we enable that, and then we can simply just start extruding this path that we want. Some things to keep in mind is when you're working on something like this, you really need to know what the model is going to be used for at this stage. Is it going to be used in animation? If it's a character such as this, is that character going to talk? Is it purely going to be a background character? What are those requirements? Because those requirements are then basically going to specify the absolute minimum amount of work that you can put in. If you need, oops, that's not what I wanted. If you need to do a character that's going to be a primary character, and that character is going to be talking really up close to the camera, you need to have a lot of detail in your mesh. You need to have a lot of flexibility in your mesh because your model needs to be able to do a lot of different things. You've got to be able to grin, you've got to be able to frown, you've got to be able to do all of that kind of stuff. However, on the flip side, if your character is way back in the background and you're never going to see it and there's no facial animation whatsoever, you can get by with a much simpler mesh. If it's a background character, you're focused more on the overall form. If it's a foreground character, not only do you need good form, but you also need really, really good detail within the mesh. So we can start extruding that. Since I've got snapping on, it just automatically conforms to the surface. And this just is, it's a pretty tedious process, but it's a lot of fun if you like this kind of stuff. Maybe it's a little sadistic at the same time.
Do you use F2 script for this?
Yes. So that's actually a tool that I'll talk about now. So there's an add-on. It's bundled with Blender. That's called F2. Just F2. It's awesome. You should be using it. Basically, what it allows you to do is very quickly add new geometry. So for example, here I've added in this loop down here, this loop right here, and it works. So I've got that initial kind of layout put in place. But if I want to start filling this, I don't really want to just extrude an edge and fill all this, or maybe extrude an edge like this, and then fill these. It's not that bad, we can do it quickly, but it becomes really tedious really quickly, particularly if you're working on a big, complete model. Like if you're doing like a statue that's robed, that's a real pain. So instead, what you can do is basically select a corner vertex, hit F, and it will automatically just pull that out. You can then grab it, do it again, do it again. In another case, let's say we've got, this is, you wouldn't normally extrude it this way, but let's just say you have something like this. Okay, so you've got this path like this, and you've got just this open area. You can just select a single edge, F, done. So it's really, really quick for doing stuff like that. And so definitely you want to use that in your workflows. Now that's all really crappy, so we're going to get rid of that.
But in this kind of workflow, there is one annoying thing, because if you just extrude from one single vertex the whole face, you have to correct the last vertex also. It's not snapping with it.
Right. That's actually changed, I think, in the development version of F2, which is not included in Trunk, like in the main Blender build, but probably will be updated. I think that the developers changed it based on request to make it automatically activate grab each time you do it. So each time, like if I go in here, right now if I hit F, it hasn't snapped to the surface and I can just move my mouse. It would be nice, since in this kind of scenario, I have to hit F and then I hit G every single time because I need it to snap to the surface and maybe the position's not exactly what I want. So in the updated version, which you can find on Blender Artist or wherever it's at, probably.
Is that already?
Oh, it doesn't have a link to it. It's not in SVN yet. I don't think. I think it's basically a testing feature because some people didn't want it, some people did, so he's testing it. Yeah?
Couldn't you take a ready-made face mesh and then get it close to this, and when it's close enough, you snap it?
You could. So like if you already had a clean mesh like this that was already done or fairly similar, you could go in, you could tweak that shape, maybe just go in with proportional editing mode, work on the shape and make it match, and then use shrink wrap to just snap it in quickly. In my own experience, I don't like doing that because for whatever reason, even though it seems like it would be much faster, I always spend more time trying to adapt an existing mesh to fit a new one than I do if I just recreate it from scratch. That's probably not going to be the case for everyone, but that's been my experience. Plus, I just enjoy this process. So we can use some shortcuts, things like doing, like the eyes. We can start with a circle because we want to have just a circle around the eyes. So that definitely helps, and then we can just extrude and scale this out, snap it to the surface. And one thing to remember, basically, your surface snapping is going to be activated every time you use a transform. Every time you scale, rotate, or move, it's going to be snapping those selected vertices to the surface. Doing things like edge slide or edge loops will not snap to the surface, so just be sure that you're realizing that, what's snapping and what's not. So we have our mesh. We can keep doing this. It's a long, tedious process. I'm currently working on some tools to improve this process. I don't want to hijack the demo, unless you want to see it.
And another way, could you use the B-surfaces for this?
Yes. So B-surfaces is another example of a tool that you can use. So B-surfaces is another add-on that's included with Blender. I talked about this quite a lot last year. It's a really cool tool that allows you to do some very fast extrusions based on grease pencil strokes. So for example, if I want to select these areas here, and I just want to bring out a stroke like this, I won't use that one, that's a shortcut, that's mine. You just click Add Surface. It doesn't work in local view. Holy smokes. Oh, I know what happened. Hold on. There we go. Okay. So yeah, so if I have my stroke, I can just click Add Surface, and it will extrude those areas to match it, and then I can adjust the settings down here. I can set the amount of loops to follow through. I can say whether it should, follow the actual stroke. I can increase a few different settings for various things. Most of these you just leave it default. And it does work really, really well for doing stuff like this. Note that it did not snap to the surface, so I have to reselect everything and snap it. But so I can do things like if I want to select, this upper portion, deselect that, and I want to quickly just match this form, I can do this. In my case, I have a hotkey set up just with my quick tools to add B-surface, and it will generate that mesh. So this is actually really awesome. I like this tool a lot, and it works really well for filling in patches of geometry. So generally if you have something like this, so I want to just basically fill this whole area with just a patch of geometry. I can select these, I deselect the corner vertex, and that just tells B-surfaces that, hey, that's the corner. I select this whole thing, or I just draw a stroke down the perimeter of that patch that I want, and I click Add Surface. So that works really well, and again is really good for filling in large patches of geometry really quickly. It can be a little bit funky. Some people don't like B-surfaces because it doesn't give you a lot of control over the in-between stuff. Normally it's good because you want evenly interpolated geometry through here, but if you didn't, then it's a little bit of a pain. Some people like it, some people don't. Try it out. If it works for you, fantastic. If it doesn't, fine. Now, one area where it absolutely fails, and, well, not absolutely, but it doesn't give any kind of benefit, and where our existing Retopo tools fail, is things like this. How would you do this? Yes, there's these ways to do it, but I'm curious to hear your guys' suggestions. Somebody said something. Yeah, so you twist it. In this case, you actually don't really care about the twisting in this, because if you look at this form, like if we just go in to, how can I do this? Oh, I can do this. Go away. I can do, oh, come on. All right, never mind, I can't do that. Basically, if you look at this, if you start looking at the silhouette, the twisting has very little impact on it. And so if you just had a smooth cylinder like this, it would actually work pretty well. The things you want to think about in this case are when you're working with these kinds of forms, what contributes to the silhouette, what doesn't. As we zoom around here, you can see we've got a little bit of a bump right there. We have a little one here. We've got a little one here. But for the most part, it's a relatively smooth form. And so all of this little detail doesn't necessarily need to be in your mesh. You could get away with a normal map, bump map, or basically anything to actually create that surface in your final model. Or you could model it all really intricately. That's also fine too. That's just going to take a lot of time. So normally what we would do, and this is, by the way, a shameless self-plug in just a moment, because it's a tool that we're making. Normally what you would do is you would use a mesh and a circle. You would go in, you'd set your vertex count. I was in local view, so it didn't work. There we go. So you go and you'd add a circle, set your vertex count to 12, I don't know why that's not working, and you would just scale it up, fit the rough form overall, make sure snapping is not enabled. That's one downfall to surface snapping, is it cannot work on more than one angle at a time, because basically it takes your current viewing angle and just says, hey, push it straight back. And so if you have something like this geometry back here, even though intuitively our mind says, hey, that's on the back, I want it to just snap to the back, it won't, because instead it's going to do this. It's just going to bring it to the surface, because it just finds the first surface from your view, brings it to that. So that's a nice thing and a bad thing. In cases like this, it's a bad thing. So normally what we would do is we would just extrude this, we would scale it down, and I would turn off snapping yet again. So we do something like this, and then we add in a whole bunch of edge loops in between, and then bit by bit start shaping this to fit a little bit more accurately. We don't have to get, well, we got to be more particular than that, but. This is most easily done with a mouse. Okay. This is not going to be close enough, but you'll start to see the downfalls of a workflow like this. Because now we would use a shrink wrap modifier. And we'd grab that. Let's see, this object is called horns. I actually named something for once. We would use a shrink wrap, insert the horns, and say nearest surface point. And you can see what's happened is it started snapping to the actual surface. So if I just hide everything else, you can see that that works. But it's also messy. I can make it much cleaner, but I'm actually going to have to go in and do more work to make it clean. I just want it to just work. So we are working on, and have released said tool. It's called Contours. It's available, it's all GPL, so you can go to our GitHub it's github.com/cgcookie/script-bakery, I think it is right now for the current version. You can download it from there if you want, or if you want to support the development, you can buy it from CGCookie. But basically what it allows you to do is specify your vertex count. In this case, we'll do 12, select your object, and click Draw Contours. And now I can go in, draw that, and so for forms like this, it becomes really quick. And everything is automatically conformed to the surface, and it's just basically extruding the previous stroke. Although it's better than that, because if I just realize down here, crap, I actually need more geometry. I don't want these really long rectangular quads. Cut in another one. I can go and cut another one here. I can select one. I can rotate it. I can grab it. I don't know how well you can see that. It's right there. I know that the screen resolution kind of sucks on the projector, but so you've got pretty good control. As soon as you're ready, just hit enter, and you've got, I have too many objects. Get rid of that nasty one. And you've got a nice clean mesh. So you could take that further if you wanted, but it works really well for the cylindrical forms. So anything like arms, legs, horns, you name it, you can do really, really quickly. So when then combined with all the other tools that you're working with, it gives you a pretty quick workflow. Now, we've got about 20 minutes left, so I'm going to try and have like 10 minutes just for questions and demos. So we're going to jump forward and look at multi-res. So we've retopoed our entire model. It's nice and clean. We've got good geometry. We're happy with it. It works really well. We have something like this. And at this point, I probably don't need the vertex size that big. Okay, so we've got our clean model. Process like this can take anywhere from an hour to 20 hours. It's really going to depend on, practice, experience, type of model, whatever you're working on. If you do a lot of faces, this won't be too long. I think in this case, this was like 3 hours. It's a tedious process, though, retopology is, but it's not too bad. So we have our model, and we want to now add in all that detail, because remember that with the dynamic topology, we were trying not to do the detail, so now is when we really want to do the detail. You can see I've done a little bit of that in here, so you can see I've got things like the eyebrows started, I've done the wrinkles above the eyes, started doing the inside of the eyes, started doing some more lips detail, and we could add as much or as little on this as we wanted. Let me just make sure that it's off. It is. So basically what you do, let's just delete this. You have your nice retopoled model. You literally just go in, you add a multi-resolution modifier, and we can go ahead and just jump right to sculpt mode. And now using the same sculpting brushes that we use with dynamic topology, but not enabling dynamic topology, if we do this, it's going to get all kinds of disastrous results once we start adding in multi-res. We can just start sculpting. So we'll start by subdividing once. So it's going to subdivide everything, just like a subdivision surface modifier. Gives us a lot more geometry to work with. We can use clay strips. We can use whatever. Nice thing is that if we retopoled it well, and this could definitely be better, we've already got our forms. So we don't care about building up the structure. We don't care about doing things like that. We can just jump right into the detail. So maybe I decide, you know what, I'd like to have a much greater crease around her nose. I can just go right in, start adding in that little bit of detail. Maybe I'll go ahead and jump up one more level just to have a little bit more control. I can go and I can start adding in the crease for the top of the eye. Maybe use a slightly larger brush. Maybe she's got crow's feet. Maybe we've got, strong wrinkles here. We've got corner of the mouth. We can really go in and just start doing the fun detail that most people really like to do right from the get-go and get into trouble because they do it too early. So this is, if you really like doing detail work because you like the finished effect, this is really the fun part because you can just do all of the stuff that otherwise you were trying to tell yourself, no, I don't want to do this yet, I shouldn't do this yet, I'm causing problems. Yeah. And so you're fairly unrestricted. Main thing you want to try and do as much work on this level of detail as possible, just because with the multi-res, just kind of with the way that it works, you don't really want to go down once you've gone up. You should try and always work on the highest level currently available, just because if I do something drastic, like pull that out, and I go down a level. So if I go down right here, actually we'll just go down 2 just to really demo this, and then I grab this, move it way over there, and then go up, we get things like this. You start getting problems where it's trying to take your first changes and then interpolate them with your previous changes, and sometimes they just don't work very well. So when in doubt, always sculpt on the highest level you currently have, which also means don't subdivide until you need to. So do all the work that you can on this level, and then subdivide. So let's just assume I've done all my work, I'm out of resolution, and now I'm starting to do things like skin pores, I'm doing small moles, whatnot, and I just don't have enough resolution. That's when I subdivide, but not until then. When you start out initially, adding 1 or 2 levels just to get started is not a big deal. Just be aware that compounds very quickly. Yes?
Are there any problems with reshape? Because you could avoid this problem with reshape.
You could. So reshape, she was mentioning that you could avoid some of those problems with the interpolation errors by using the reshape option, and that's this one here, which what it does, I think are you thinking of apply base? Yeah, so reshape and apply base are 2 options within the multi-resolution modifier, where apply base basically allows you to take the changes from your high-end sculpt, like this, apply base, go down, and it's tried to interpolate that back to the beginning. So this is a really valuable tool. It works great. It's not always going to do exactly what you want, because this is going to apply the base from your beginning level, from level 0. But let's just say you have 6 levels. You jump down to level 3, you add in some nice detail, you jump back up to level 6, and now those interpolations are broken. You've got crisscrossing meshes and things like that. Reshape won't fix that. So what you can do, if you get to the stage where you have to make changes on a lower level, basically you just, you go down to the lowest level, you make the change, then step up 1, fix any problems, step up again, fix the problem, step up again, and generally fixing the problem just means using the smooth brush to get it out. And that's about it. So, we're pretty much at the final stage as far as the detailing goes, so you can just basically start sculpting and add in all the detail that you want. In this case, it seems my undo is broken, so I didn't really want that, but There we go. It's mostly gone. Yeah, so you can really just kind of do whatever you want at this stage as far as the detail is concerned. You know, for her, in this case, she doesn't have a lot of really defining facial detail. You know, she's got the really sharp brow line and cheekbones and things like that. She doesn't have a lot of wrinkles. She doesn't have a lot of, you know, skin changes. It's a very polished skin. So this is going to be, you know, mostly complete. Now I'd do things to, you know, like I would sharpen up the cheekbones. I'd really define the lip line. I'd put in some creases in the lips, you know, define the wrinkles over here, you know, kind of what we're doing in this one. Now, I would not consider this finished. I would continue doing polish work. But you notice that as far as like the surface detail, there's very little in here. It's mostly form polishing. But you do that same kind of thing here. So, you know, I've kind of better defined the eyebrow line. So even if the eyebrows weren't there, you'd still see that. And that's all the kind of stuff that you'll do at this stage in the modeling process, or in the sculpting process. From here, you're basically done with modeling. You could, you know, sometimes, depending on the model or how complex it is, sometimes people will go in and they'll retopologize it again and then bake that down. You know, if they've changed things dramatically or whatnot, you can do it as many or as few times as you want. Generally, once is enough. It just depends on how drastic your changes are. You know, if you decide at this point, you know, maybe your art director comes back and says, hey, she needs horns, or hey, she needs a completely different shape of ear. Sometimes you might need to go in and do some drastic changes to account for that. But yeah, so from here, you'd texture it, you'd rig it, you'd do whatever. Most of the things that you would do is such as like rigging and such, you can actually just work with the multi-res. So you rig the actual base mesh and then the multi-res will actually be interpolated across those. You will generally see some problems, like if you're doing, let's just say you're doing your arm, and you've rigged the arm, you've sculpted it like this, and then you bend it, you'll tend to see some like overlapping, where like you'll just basically see something like that, where basically your vertex groups are not being very well smoothed out, and they're not being interpolated across the multi-res. Those kinds of issues you just kind of have to solve in afterwards, or you just don't necessarily render with the multi-res. Because the nice thing with the multi-res here, once we have all this detail, we can either bake it down to like a bump map or a normal map, or we can actually animate and render an animated multi-res sculpt. It kind of depends on your project. It kind of depends on how well it works. Like in the case of the Pteranodon that I showed you, most of the multi-res worked until you got into areas like the wings and the membrane, just freaked out. They were not very happy. Part of that was we could have done a lot more work with the actual weight painting on the rig, but it just depends on your needs, what you're going to have to do, and just, you know, how the end results work. But for the most part, you know, that'll be the final stage, and you can just kind of adapt it from there. So, any last questions as far as the general workflow or anything like that? Yes?
I have quite a bit of problem, you know, warming up with the sculpting
Uh-huh.
process. And one of the things which are sometimes a problem is, for example, if you have regions like where, you know, the bottom and the top lip meet, just, you know, if you want to shape the details of maybe just the bottom lip and don't want to influence the top
Right.
lip, so like you have an idea how you work out that things.
You don't. Basically, so the problem that Wolfgang is having is when you have things like lips are a perfect example, or let's just say you have somebody's hands that are closed. You can see this a little bit more easily. Say their hands are closed. FYI, don't ever sculpt hands like this unless you really explicitly need to, because it's just a stupid idea because you can't get to the insides of the fingers. But so just say you had to. If you want to sculpt the insides here, you're trying to only work on the index finger, you really can't get in there. So like lips are a good example because oftentimes you'll sculpt them closed. One solution would be to simply open the character's mouth when sculpting. So that would work well. And that's actually a good idea. If your character is going to be animated with facial animation and you're doing the mouth, the inside, and everything, model it open because you'll have a lot more control. Now, oftentimes when you're sculpting, you don't really care about the detail on the inside of the mouth, so unless your character is going like this all the time, you maybe don't need to care as much about that. But basically what you need, Wolfgang, is we need a better masking tool, hint, hint, developers, that allow you to grow a mask. Just like you can grow a selection, like if I select this area and I hit Control plus, not Control minus, Control plus, I can grow that selection. So imagine if within sculpting, what we need is I need to be able to go in here, mask that, and then grow the mask. Because then it's growing based on the topology, not on the surrounding area. So it would actually grow out to fill in all the bottom lip, and it would grow continuously out like this, and it would actually go all the way around to the corner of the mouth before it ever started going up to the top lip. So that would be a really easy way to do that. The other option that we can't do right now, but there is people talking about it, is the ability to convert a mesh selection. Like if you just select this area, you grow that selection, have that automatically apply a mask. So that kind of stuff would be really nice. We can't do it right now, but there's solutions being talked about. Yeah?
I have one workaround for that and a question.
Uh-huh.
One workaround I did was I sort of rigged the character and then used geometry to open them up.
Yeah, that would be perfect. I actually did the same thing on the Pteranodon. If we look at...
It doesn't even have to be a clean rig, just,
Yeah, totally.
rig, bottom, and upper lip, and
So if you look here, I sculpted him with dynamic topology with his mouth closed. Stupid idea, because the final render for this guy looks like this. You're just staring down his gullet. And I had no way to go in and sculpt the detail on there without just doing it afterwards. So when I retopoed it, I promptly opened his mouth. So that way when I was doing the multi-res sculpt, I could get in there and account for my mistakes. And then what was your question?
the question
And then I'll get you.
there might be a really simple solution for that, but if you're using a brush and you use for sculpting, and you zoom in and out, the brush size changes.
Yeah.
Is there a button for that?
There is. So in sculpt mode, go down to the bottom, and under, it may have changed, hold on.
I mean, most of the time this is useful, but if you're painting with brushes and...
There it is. It's this option right here. So you can lock the radius or lock the strength such that as you zoom in and out, it won't change. One way or the other. By default, it's unlocked such that the brush stays the same relative to your screen, not relative to the model. So,
I prefer that, but sometimes you need the brush.
yeah. I prefer that the brush size never change, but probably because I learned that way. It's actually kind of annoying for some people. You first.
Okay. So my question is about the complexity.
Uh-huh.
You thought or will be thinking about not stroke-based retopology, but guide-based auto retopology.
Yes.
I know you're familiar with ZBrush.
Yes, I am.
So you know Z-Remesher.
Yes, I do.
His job.
It's kind of insane. So the question is basically, is in reference to the contours tool that I demoed, have we thought about guide-based auto retopology? So you, like if you have an arm, draw a single guide and it just generates the mesh along it. ZBrush has this functionality. It's not our initial targets. Basically, the roadmap that we're doing, because this is an ongoing development, so like right now we're working on the second tool, which is a polystrips tool, so you can draw in like the key loops around the face and things like that. Basically, we're starting one at a time. So first is contours, then it's strips, so drawing lines of polygons, and then it's patches for doing like big chunks of polygons. From there, we'll basically have built a lot of the foundation we need as far as generating the geometry, and so that may then flow into automatic retopo. That'll be a ways down the road. We've got some papers on it that we're looking at that may be fairly realistic to do. Personally, I don't like auto retopo. Partially because I'm too much of a snob when it comes to my mesh. I want to have full control. But it does provide some really nice benefits, and it's very quick. So it is definitely something we're looking at.
I mean,
So.
I also like to make retopo myself, but the first time I saw this Z-Remesher.
Oh, it's insane. It's
almost like
totally insane.
Perfect.
Well, and it's really good for doing like sculptural stuff. So like if you do a really quick dynamic topology mesh and then you want to do some multi-res on top of that, it's really good for like quickly remeshing a model with nice topology for the most part. It starts getting a little iffy when you start doing things like around the eyes and whatnot. I haven't seen very good results from it in that sense, where you start to get a lot of weird kind of flows within the mesh. But for the most part, it's really good. And then you had a question?
Sure, just a small way when you have practically see and sculpting on a higher resolution level, easy way to unhide stuff you don't need while modeling. For example, when you like have a sculpture, like having the hand in front of the face, just unhide when you just start working on the hand, when you just rotate, you have always like the face in the way. Can you just select the hand and have only one of them?
Yes. So what you can do, the question is basically for performance or just for personal preference reasons, is there a way to basically hide everything that you're not working on? There's a couple of different ways. One is just to separate it out. So, for example, if you're doing a complete body and a head, sometimes it's really beneficial to actually make the head a separate object than the body, and then just kind of smooth out the transition, and you can fix that seam later down the road. So that's one way to do it. It's particularly good, like, oftentimes we need a lot more detail in the face than we do in the rest of the body, so that solves that problem as well, particularly if you're doing multi-res. But let's say you're working on a single global mesh, like this guy here. Maybe I only want to work on the body and the wings keep getting annoying. Just press Alt-B and drag across what you want, and it will hide everything else. Now, in this case, I don't think, and Andy, you might know, I don't think this changes the performance a whole lot. Does it make it slower? Well, there you go. So that's a bit of a problem. As far as performance goes that you can couple with this, the single best thing that you can do when you're sculpting, or even when you're just modeling, turn off double-sided on your mesh. You'll get a performance boost of, depending on your computer, sometimes as much as 200%.
This can be the only problem.
Oh, is it really?
Yes, double-sided this can be the only problem.
Well, there you go. So if you have an NVIDIA card, turn off double-sided, which I do. So it makes a huge difference. On this machine, which is the 15-inch Retina MacBook Pro, if I'm sculpting with double-sided on, let's just say, maybe it maxes out at 600,000 polys or whatever it is. If I turn double-sided off, I can easily go to 1.5 million with the same performance. So we've got time for probably 2 more questions. We've got 2 minutes. You were first.
Is there any way to use vertex features instead of polygons in order to quickly hide toggle removability?
Not yet. You can do it within edit mode, because you can just basically assign the vertex groups, use that to select those areas, and then just hit H. There's no way to apply that to sculpting right now, though. Hopefully soon. And then you?
Something question, when you have a vertex on an edge, you want to move the vertex along the edge.
Yes.
Is there a way of
Double tap G. So as of 2.68, I think, we now have a quick way to do vertex and or edge slide. So if I select an edge or a single vertex, I can either hit Control V and choose slide, which is also Shift V, and then I can just specify the edge that I want to slide it along. Or if you just double tap G, so G, then it will also activate that. Nice thing about double tapping G is it will auto detect whether you have a single vertex or no, whether you have vertices disconnected or edges. So if I have an edge, double tap G, it activates edge slide. If I have 2 disconnected vertices and that they're not immediately connected by an edge, double tap G, it activates vertex slide. So let's see, probably one more. Yes?
Yeah, I was just sort of interested in the difference between multi-res and bump map. Texture painting, say the scales on one.
Sure.
Using a multi-res.
As in the benefits to each, or?
Yeah, I mean, they both achieve the same sort of effect.
Yes and no. So, basically, the question was kind of what's the difference between bump mapping and multi-res? As in, your example was if you're creating scales on a dinosaur, should you bump map them or multi-res sculpt them? Basically, the difference with multi-res, you're actually sculpting in real geometry. You've got real actual silhouette difference and offset and whatnot. With a bump map or a normal map, it's faked, basically. It's just rendering the surface with the appearance of the bump map. I'm not going to jump into the technical details because I'll probably get them wrong. There's people here that can explain that very well. So it's just faked, essentially. And so within the viewport, you can do it, or at render time, it's nice. But if you have, say, if you get a real good close-up shot of the scales, you're going to actually see the difference in the offset between the scales. With a bump map or normal map, you would actually distinctly see, if we're talking really high quality in shot, you're going to see that those scales aren't real, probably. Now, a similar thing is a displacement map. So a displacement map is very similar to a bump map in that it's basically a grayscale version of the detail that you want. The difference is that a displacement map actually affects the geometry. So it will offset the geometry based on the image texture. And so you can use that as well. So one thing that you would do, say for example, you didn't want to actually render the multi-resolution sculpted model. Maybe your deformations aren't working very well with the rig or whatnot. You can take your multi-res, add in all your details, then in the baking panel, go down here to displacement. Nope, displacement. Bake from multi-res, and then assign a UV texture, click bake. It will bake out the displacement information, and then you can actually add that to a displacement modifier on top of a subsurf or something, and then it will actually offset your geometry to make it real. Okay. You're probably going to get better performance while actually working on the model with multi-res. You'll get better performance at render time with displacement, I think. Don't quote me on that. So, all right, got to wrap up. Thank you, everyone.
The next presentation will be in about 15 minutes.
It's intended for people that have experience in 3D using Max or whatever that want to learn. So it does not go into any kind of the concepts behind how to make a good model. It doesn't do anything. It basically just shows you where to go. So if you have experience in Max and just want to learn Blender, it's good.
So if I'm learning like a year or so, I have a little bit knowledge. It's not.
Yeah, you should be fine. Yeah, no, it should be good. There'll be some things that are different. Like we've got some additional tools now that we didn't have at the time.